Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay, this is a video that I have literally been putting off making for like more than a year because every time I sit down to think about it, I'm always like, what is it that I really want to communicate here? And I'm not 100% sure, so we'll just see where this journey takes us. But basically, I mentioned before that I used to work in a bookstore. I used to work at Borders, RIP. And I think that it definitely shaped my perception of books, publishing, and general reading and readership for sure. I think it was a formative experience for me. It was during college. Now, I didn't work there for like years and years. I worked there, I think it was like 19 and 20. And I didn't work full time. So like a bunch of caveats here. I'm not saying that I'm like a veteran bookseller. I also think that this would have been about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. Wow, I'm getting old quick. So also the book publishing world has changed so much. But that being said, I remember before working at a bookstore, I used to really romanticize it and like think that it would be amazing. And there are definitely parts of it that are amazing, but I think there are other parts that are not as amazing. So I just thought I would kind of talk about what my experience is and frankly solicit people who have been booksellers more recently or booksellers in different contexts to kind of share some of their experiences as well. Because I think if you're a book nerd, one of your dream jobs you think is being a bookseller. So anyway, I just thought I would kind of tell you guys a little bit about what my experience was like. So first, in terms of like kind of setting the scene here, especially for those of you who are not in the US. So Borders was a very large kind of like box store chain bookstore in the US. And I'm not totally sure what the to and from dates were, but like, let's say I think it went out of business maybe like 6 or 7 years ago now. It wasn't because actually the individual stores were not doing well. It is because it was like chronically mismanaged at the top, apparently. But Borders is very similar. Like if you kind of have a reference point of Barnes and Noble, like it's that kind of vibe, or Chapters or Waterstone, like large box retailers, but what they're selling are books. So that is where I worked. In my particular store, we also had a Seattle's best, I think, coffee shop. So there was like a coffee shop in the bookstore, and it was a really, really large store. It was in one of the largest, it's like in the largest outdoor shopping area of my hometown in Knoxville. So it was a really successful branch. Like we were really busy all of the time. If you were in Knoxville, if you ever go to the Turkey Creek Ulta, it was in that location. And I was one of the like people who helped open up the store. So I was there pretty early on. And in terms of what it's like in that environment, so first of all, I will say we were definitely snobbish and felt like that Borders was better than Barnes and Nobles. I felt that before I worked there, and I still feel that to this day. I miss Borders as sort of that type of bookstore, because I do think that just in terms of like the overall atmosphere was a lot like cozier and like more inviting, and also kind of the way we were trained to deal with customers, I think was better than at least Barnes and Noble was at the time. I think they've been trying to change some of the way they deal with their customers now. So I'm not trying to diss anyone who is a current Barnes & Noble bookseller. I'm talking about back in the day. In terms of like having a retail job, I would say that particular experience I had was probably much closer to working in another big box retail environment as opposed to working in a bookstore. And the reason I would say that is because I was one of the only booksellers at that location who actually was a really big book nerd. So most of the people who worked there worked it because they were looking for a retail type job. So they didn't necessarily have a huge passion for books. And I think that was something that kind of like surprised and disappointed me a little bit initially when I got there, because I was expecting that like all my coworkers would be huge fellow book nerds and that we would, geek out about books all the time. And that just really wasn't quite what the environment was. Because the other thing that Borders sold a lot of were like movies. So there were actually several people who were big movie aficionados, and like that was sort of what they really liked about working there. But I didn't actually meet that many other people who were big book nerds. Now, in terms of like the day-to-day reality, again, I feel like when I was working there, a lot of the experiences I had were probably pretty similar to other retail jobs. So for one thing, like my takeaway from that time is that all humans are inherently rude, dirty, and stupid. which is a little harsh, but it was just sort of like, it was my first retail job, and just seeing how people like would spill coffee in the middle of an aisle in the back and then just literally leave the cup there and like not tell anyone and not do any, like, just so rude and so gross. Like the number of like just gross things people left around and like whatever was just so frustrating. People would also just leave books everywhere. Like we would spend usually about an hour and a half at the end of every shift just like gathering up books and reshelving them, because people just leave them everywhere in a bookstore. So like to this day, I'm very religious about like, if I pick up a book and I'm not gonna buy it, I always take it back to where I found it. And then people, you know, in retail, people are just rude. So like people would try to be using coupon codes or whatever, and they wouldn't work, and then they would start yelling at you. And actually I had a great manager when I first started there who was like, if you have a moment in a customer interaction where you think they don't pay me enough to deal with this, that's when you need to call me. And I was like, I appreciate that advice. So, you know, I would definitely have really entitled customers who would just be like really aggressive or rude or whatever. And, you know, that, again, I think that's a part of working a real retail job. I do think that everybody should work like a retail or a like food service type job, because I think it gives you, if you can hold on to your memories of it, it gives you a lot more patience for people. And just like anytime I'm frustrated in that kind of environment, like my first like memory is like, these people are making like not very much money, and this is not their fault usually. Like usually the situation I'm frustrated about has nothing to do with them, so like I'm very careful to not take it out on people. But you know, I think a lot of the day-to-day working in a bookstore, it was very similar to any other retail job. One other kind of retail aspect of this in terms of like why I ultimately didn't stay there, because I had initially planned to just stay there throughout college and have that be my part-time job. But the problem, and I think this happens a lot in retail and food service type jobs, is that I was one of their best booksellers because I actually liked books. So like I was really good at hand selling people. Like you could come up to me and ask me for a recommendation, and I would be able to give you one because I was staying up on what the new releases were, because I was interested. I read a lot myself. Like I was good at my job in terms of like being on the floor. And because of that, they always put me on at their peak times, which were basically Friday, Saturday, and Sunday afternoons to close. And if you close at like midnight and it takes another hour and a half, I wasn't getting home until like 2 a.m. So it was like all of the typical times where other people would be like out or have plans, like I could never go because they were always putting me on what for them was my best shift because I sold books, but for me was the worst shift because I had to like I never could go out with people. So that ultimately kind of burned me out because they would be giving me all of my hours when I didn't want them, basically. Yeah, I think that's pretty typical of a retail job as well. Moving on to some like more book specific things about working in a bookstore, I think you definitely get a perspective on how much what people are currently excited about is driven by marketing dollars when you work in a bookstore. So we would get like basically publishers, at least, and again, this is 10 years ago, I'm not totally sure that this is exactly how it works now, but 10 years ago, you know, publishers would have bought like various placements in the store. So in Borders, like in the front section, there's all these like open tables and like big shelves that don't have that many books on them, but like they're all facing out. Like kind of the front of store, like the things that we're really trying to push on people who just have sort of wandered in and are kind of just looking for something and not like a particular book. I think seeing the fact that the publishers buy so much of that in bookstores was really informative to me and kind of made me much more aware of how marketing dollars really do influence a lot of the hype and a lot of like what we buy as readers, especially if you're somebody who reads a lot of front list. I think it gave me a lot of insight into like books that get picked for book clubs, like how much like gerrymandering and like horse trading is happening to like get something picked as, I mean, I don't know this, but I assume as like Reese Witherspoon's book of the month deal or like book club pick for that quarter or whatever. Like there's a lot of just like money changing hands to make all of that happen. And I think I didn't really fully understand that prior to working there, because I think you know, you hear about a certain book and you know it's getting a lot of hype. And I mean, of course you have some awareness of marketing dollars behind that, but I think just literally seeing, even in what I thought was sort of like, oh, like this is a curated space for books and like the front tables are just like what people really like or is selling really well right now. And I think there's some of that, and it probably also really depends on the size of the bookstore. Like, I would have a lot more faith, like I do have a lot more faith in some of my independent bookstores staff selection type things than I do at some of the bigger retailers, just because I saw, at least at the time, how much of those were not really staff picks or not really like specific to our store or our customer base. It was all driven by publishing marketing dollars. I think working in a bookstore also really kind of like gave me a reality check in terms of some of my writing aspirations. And what I mean by that is, you know, in your head how many books there are in the world and just like how many people have a book in them and are trying to get published and all of that. But I think having like being in a gigantic retailer, like a huge space just filled with books, and shelving them and seeing what sold and what didn't, and seeing how many copies of different types of books we would have on hand, I think really sold home to me just how hard it is to make it as a writer, in terms of like, there is so much noise. It is so difficult for your book to get published, and then once it's published, to find an audience, because there are just so many books like it, no matter how unique you think your book is. And like, of course, I do, I have read books that I do feel like are truly unique in some respect, but like in general, very few books are really all that different than most of the other books that get published. So I think beforehand I kind of, and also I was just young. I was like, oh, my writing is just like the girl on, like Hannah on Girls, or she's like, I really think I'm the voice of my generation. I mean, I wasn't quite there, but I think I had like more of a belief in like, oh, if you're just really good, you will be able to find your audience and you'll get published. I think just being around the business side of it really helped me understand how hard that is and how unlikely that is. So yeah, I think that was another thing that kind of came from me working in a bookstore. I think also that working in a bookstore made me really comfortable about talking about books with people. Like, I mean, I'd always been a book nerd, and like I always liked my English class and was engaged in the discussions in there and then with friends or whatever. But I think having to like come up with recommendations for people, or like talk to people about what it was they were looking for, or just even seeing what people were buying at the register and chatting with them about it, made me much more comfortable just like sort of talking about books off the cuff, which probably serves me well on this platform. But I think it also just gave me, like, at least in that time period, I had a real hyper awareness of like what things people were looking for in books, and it helped me kind of like make some connections about like, oh, if you like this, I think you might like this because I see people buying this who also buy this, kind of a thing. So that was always really interesting to me, and something I really liked about my job was just sort of seeing, especially some of my regular customers, like kind of how their tastes intersected with other customers, and just kind of making some of the connections about like, oh, I never thought about, the fact that if you liked this part of this book, that you might also like this type of nonfiction or something. So I really enjoyed that, and I think I learned a lot about how to talk about books with people, make recommendations, and how to kind of relate books to each other and see connections between books and like people's taste, if that makes sense. So that was probably my favorite part of my job. And finally, the biggest memory I have about working as a bookseller, and essentially the reason that I ultimately quit, was that being around books all day was not good for my bottom line. So because I had an employee discount, and because I'm a book nerd, and because, as you guys have seen, I am like a book hoarder, I was just spending so much money back at where I was working, because I was constantly seeing these new titles that I would get excited about, and even knowing in some cases that the only reason I was feeling hyped about it was because the publishers were putting so much money behind it, and because I had to talk to people all day about it because it was like the latest Oprah pick or whatever. It would just make me want it. So I realized that like it's not good for my bottom line to work with books directly day to day, just because I have very little self-control. So ultimately, and I was lucky, the scholarship I was on where I was going to university pretty much paid for my room and board. So I was essentially working for like gas money and whatever. So I didn't have a lot of like must-haves that I had to use that money for, and having the disposable income, I just was putting so much of it back into Borders, and I was like, this seems like not the reason I was getting a job. So ultimately I decided I got an internship in my field I was studying that was paid, and that was a better situation in terms of me not just spending all of my money on books. But that's sort of like my abiding memory of it, is that if you are around books all day, at least for me, it becomes very hard not to buy them, because you just see how many cool books there are that maybe you would never have even noticed if you weren't, spending today shelving in memoir or whatever. Like, it just made me aware of like how many awesome books there are, and kind of getting back to that whole idea of noise. I think it also just made me sad, because I'm like, there's so many cool books that nobody's ever gonna read, really. Like, there's only ever gonna be like 500 people who read this really interesting book, but I would like be like, I'll be one of those 500 people. And that's how I was spending so much of my money back there. Anyway, I guess I don't really have like a unifying like conclusion or wrap up to my time selling books. I am really glad I did it. Like I said, I think it made me much more aware of the business side of publishing, and I think it made me a lot more resistant to some of the hype machine around books, like just because having seen kind of a little bit of how the sausage gets made, at least on the retailing aspect of it, I think it made me a little more cynical about that, which I think was probably for the good. But yeah, overall, like, I really liked working at Borders. Like, I'm sad that it's gone. It was a nice place to work. We had one situation where one of the managers in our store was basically sexually harassing people, and he was like legit gone the next day, which I think bodes well. I appreciated that. Like, they, people were really nice. People who want to work in a bookstore generally, like, or that type of a retail job, like, people were really nice. I mean, it was a great experience. I liked helping people and like giving them recommendations and shelving. I liked all of it. It was fun. But yeah, I don't think it was as like idyllic as maybe I imagined being a bookseller would be. And I think a lot of kind of book nerds imagine that being a bookseller would be this just like dream job. And like, at the end of the day, it's still a retail job. So is it doing something you like? Yes, but it definitely isn't just like the end all be all. So I guess maybe my unifying theory here is that like, I'm glad I did it, but I also would tell you not to expect that it's going to be, if you are trying to work as a bookseller, it's not going to be like some mystical, magical thing. But anyway, like I said, I'd definitely be interested to hear from people who are either currently booksellers or who have been booksellers in kind of different types of bookstores. I'd be interested to hear from like used bookstore booksellers, because like, I bet that's super interesting, seeing all these random books come in that are not necessarily pushed by the publishers, or are only pushed indirectly, I guess, when people are getting rid of them. That would be interesting. I bet like 6 months after a book is really hyped, there's probably a lot of inventory of that title. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, definitely let me know different experiences you've had as a bookseller. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. I think that will do it. I hope you're having a super lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.